The chamber doors slammed shut behind me before I even reached the podium, and 300 alien eyes turned to study the last human they expected to see standing there. My name is Ethan Cole, and I was about to deliver the final warning of my species to a room full of beings who had already decided we did not matter. The Grand Hall of the Galactic Council was carved from a single moon, its walls glowing with the soft blue light of a dying star trapped inside crystal veins. I had studied every species seated before me. The Threll delegation, tall and silver-skinned, their eyes narrowed with amusement. The Korvath elders, ancient and slow-moving, their translators humming with static. And at the center, raised above everyone else, sat Chancellor Ve Osandran of the Threll Compact, the being who had signed the order that ended a colony of 11,000 human settlers 3 weeks earlier. I placed the data crystal on the podium. It contained everything: casualty reports, orbital scans, recordings of the last transmission from Haven Colony before the signal went dark. "Chancellor Osandran," I said, and my voice carried through the translation field without a single tremor, even though my hands were shaking beneath the podium where no one could see them. "3 weeks ago, your fleet entered human space without authorization. You attacked a civilian colony. You killed families who had done nothing but farm grain under 2 suns. I am here to tell you, on behalf of Earth and every human colony beyond it, that this will not happen again." Silence, then laughter. It started with a Threll officer near the back, a sharp bark of contempt that spread through the chamber like fire through dry grass. The Korvath elders chuckled in their slow, rumbling way. Even the neutral observers from the Ondu cluster, species who rarely showed emotion in public, allowed themselves a thin smile. Chancellor Osandran raised one silver hand, and the laughter did not stop, but it quieted enough for him to speak. "Delegate Cole," he said, and I could hear the pity dripping from every syllable. "Humanity has been part of galactic civilization for what, 60 years? 70? You arrived in our space with wooden ships compared to ours, begging for trade routes, begging for technology, begging for a seat at this table we so generously gave you, and now you stand here and threaten us?" "I am not threatening you," I said. "I am warning you." "Then let me offer you a warning of my own," Osandran said, leaning forward. "Return to your homeworld. Tell your leaders that Haven Colony was a lesson, not an attack. The grain fields your people planted sit on a resource vein my compact requires. If Earth wishes to keep what remains of its colonies, it will learn its place in this galaxy, and it will learn it quickly." The laughter rose again, louder this time, rolling across the chamber like a wave I could not stop. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I simply picked up the data crystal, placed it back inside my coat, and looked at every delegation seated in that hall, one row at a time, memorizing their faces the way a person memorizes the face of someone they will never forget. "You have had 60 years to learn who we are," I said quietly. "You spent that time laughing instead of watching. That is your mistake, not ours." I turned and walked out of the grand hall, while the laughter followed me down the long crystal corridor, echoing off walls built to outlast empires. Nobody stopped me. Nobody cared enough to stop me. That, more than anything else, told me everything I needed to know about how this would end. My shuttle was waiting on the landing platform outside, its hull painted in the dull gray of a diplomatic vessel. Nothing special, nothing that would draw a second glance from the security drones patrolling the skyline. I climbed aboard and sat down across from Grace Bennett, my aide and the only other human allowed inside that chamber. "How bad was it?" she asked, though her face told me she already knew the answer. "They laughed," I said. Grace closed her eyes for a moment. She had a brother stationed at Haven Colony before the attack. He had not been found among the survivors, and there had not been many survivors to find. "So that's it then," she said. "We tried the peaceful way. We tried it for 60 years, I said. Every trade dispute, every border violation, every time they took something from us and called it a misunderstanding, we smiled, we negotiated, we signed whatever treaty they handed us, because we thought that was how you earned respect out here." I looked out the viewport as the shuttle lifted off, the crystal moon shrinking behind us, the laughter of the council still ringing in my ears even though I could no longer hear it. Now we stop asking for a seat at their table, I said, and we build our own. The flight back to the transport ship took 4 hours. I spent most of it in silence, replaying the moment Osandrin leaned forward and called Haven Colony a lesson. 11,000 people, farmers, teachers, children who had never seen Earth because they were born under a different sky. A lesson, he called it, something to teach us our place. What none of them understood, what none of the council had ever bothered to understand in 60 years of watching us bow and scrape and apologize for existing, was that humanity does not respond well to lessons taught through loss. We had a long, complicated history of turning grief into something sharper than sorrow, and the galaxy was about to receive the first demonstration of that in living memory. When we docked with the transport ship, an officer named Marcus Hale was waiting at the airlock. I had known Marcus since Flight Academy, back when we were both young enough to believe diplomacy alone could keep the peace. He did not smile when he saw my face. "That bad," he said. "Worse," I answered. "Command wants you on a secure channel the moment you're aboard," Marcus said. "High Command, not regional, Earth itself." I felt something tighten in my chest, not fear exactly, but the particular weight of knowing a decision was about to be made that could not be undone. Grace walked beside me through the narrow corridors of the transport ship, past crew members who nodded at us with the quiet respect people give to those returning from a funeral. The secure channel room was small, windowless, lit by a single overhead panel. I sat down in front of the console and entered my access codes. The screen flickered, then resolved into the face of Admiral Louise Kavanaugh, Supreme Commander of Earth Defense Command, a woman who had spent the last decade quietly building something the Galactic Council had never once suspected existed. "Delegate Cole," she said. "Report." They laughed. "Admiral," I said. "Chancellor Osandrin called the attack on Haven a lesson. He said if we want to keep our remaining colonies, we need to learn our place." Admiral Kavanaugh's expression did not change, but her eyes did, a slow hardening that I had seen only once before, on the day the first reports came in from Haven Colony. "Understood," she said. "Return to Earth immediately. Priority transport is already arranged." "Admiral, what happens now?" She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I wondered if the channel had frozen. Then she spoke, and her voice carried a weight that made the small room feel even smaller. "For 60 years, this species has shown the galaxy exactly what it wanted to see," she said. "A quiet, cooperative, unremarkable newcomer. We let them believe our shipyards were small. We let them believe our fleets were scattered and weak. We let them believe we had nothing beyond a handful of aging cruisers and a talent for filling out paperwork." "Admiral," I said carefully, "are you telling me that was never true?" "I am telling you, Delegate Cole," she said, "that you are about to find out exactly how untrue it was." The channel cut out before I could ask another question, and I sat there in the small, windowless room with Grace standing behind me, both of us staring at a blank screen that had just confirmed something I had suspected for years but never allowed myself to believe. Humanity had not spent 60 years being weak, we had spent 60 years being patient, and patience, as anyone who has ever pushed a person past their limit eventually learns, always runs out eventually. Grace put a hand on my shoulder. "What did she mean?" she asked quietly. "About finding out?" I stood up from the console, feeling the weight of everything Admiral Kavanaugh had not said pressing down on me harder than anything she had. "I don't know," I said, "but I think we're about to find out together." Outside the small window at the end of the corridor, Earth's transport fleet gathered in the dark, ordinary ships, doing ordinary work, giving away nothing of what was already moving quietly through the void, far beyond where any council sensor could see. The laughter in that crystal chamber was still echoing somewhere behind me, growing fainter with every passing hour. I had a feeling it would not be echoing for much longer. Something else was coming to take its place, and for the first time since I had joined the diplomatic corps, I found myself hoping the galaxy was ready for what it had spent 60 years refusing to see. It was not ready. Nothing could have prepared it for what came next. 6 days before I stood in front of the Galactic Council, I was standing on the observation deck of Haven Colony, watching the sky burn. I need to explain what happened there, because nothing that came after makes sense without it. Haven Colony sat on a quiet moon called Leor, orbiting a gas giant far past the edge of what most star charts even bothered labeling. 11,000 people lived there, most of them farmers, growing grain crops that thrived under the strange double light of two distant suns. My cousin, Nathan Price, had moved his family there 4 years earlier, chasing cheap land and the promise of a simpler life. I visited twice. I remembered the smell of fresh bread from the community ovens, the sound of children playing in irrigation canals, the way the whole colony gathered every evening to watch the gas giant's rings catch the light. The attack came without warning, without any declaration, without the smallest courtesy of a formal grievance filed through council channels. Threll warships dropped out of the dark sky and opened fire on the colony's shield generators before a single alarm could sound. I was not there when it happened. I was 3 systems away, finishing a trade negotiation that suddenly felt meaningless the moment the emergency broadcast reached my ship. By the time relief forces arrived, there was very little left to save. I flew to Leor myself, against every regulation that said a diplomat had no business at an active disaster site. I needed to see it. I needed to understand what I would be walking into that council chamber to speak about. What I found was a colony reduced to broken structures and silence. Rescue teams moving through the wreckage with the slow, careful movements of people who have stopped expecting to find anyone alive. Nathan was among the missing. His wife, Lily Grant, was found 3 days later, badly injured but breathing, pulled from beneath a collapsed grain silo by a rescue drone that had been searching the same debris field for 60 straight hours. Their daughter, 7 years old, was never found at all. I sat with Lily in the medical bay of the relief ship for 2 hours before I had to leave for the council session. She did not cry. She simply stared at the ceiling and asked me, over and over, the same question. Why did they do this? I did not have an answer for her then. I am not certain I have one now. What I learned in the days that followed, piecing together fragments from intelligence briefings and quiet conversations with officers who had clearance I was not supposed to have, was that the attack on Haven Colony was never about grain fields or resource veins, no matter what Chancellor Osandrin claimed in that crystal chamber. It was a test. The Threll Compact wanted to see how humanity would respond to a direct, unprovoked strike on a civilian population. They wanted to know if we would retaliate, or if 60 years of cautious diplomacy had trained us into something they could push around indefinitely. They expected outrage followed by more diplomacy, more treaties, more apologies disguised as negotiations. That is what every other species in the Council had done when the Threll Compact tested them in decades past. Push once, watch the response, calibrate the next push accordingly. What the Threll Compact did not know, what none of the Council knew, was that humanity had never actually stopped preparing since the day we first made contact with an alien species and realized, almost immediately, how vulnerable that first contact had left us. I learned the full truth on the transport ship back to Earth, 4 days after the Council laughed at my warning. Admiral Kavanaugh summoned me to a private briefing room deep in the ship's lower decks, a room with walls thick enough to block every scanning frequency known to Council technology. Marcus Hale was already there when I arrived, along with a woman I did not recognize, introduced only as Colonel Olivia Turner, of a division I had never heard of, something called Deep Horizon Command. What I am about to show you, Admiral Kavanaugh said, has been classified since before you joined the Diplomatic Corps, Delegate Cole. Very few people outside this room know it exists. The wall screen lit up, displaying a star chart of a region far beyond human-colonized space, a stretch of dark, unremarkable void that every Council survey had long ago dismissed as empty and resource-poor. 60 years ago, Colonel Turner said, when Earth first made contact with the Galactic Council, our leadership understood something the rest of you may not have considered. We were the youngest, weakest species at that table. We had no allies. We had no history of alliances to draw on. If any of the older powers ever decided humanity was more useful erased than tolerated, we would have no way to stop it. So we built something they would never think to look for, Admiral Kavanaugh continued. Not a visible fleet stationed along our borders for the Council to count and measure and use as leverage in every negotiation, A hidden one, built in the dark, beyond every surveyed system, using technology we chose never to share, never to demonstrate, never to even hint at, during 60 years of trade talks and border disputes." Unquote. The star chart shifted, revealing something that made my breath catch in my throat. Shipyards, dozens of them, spread across a dozen unremarkable systems, producing vessels unlike anything registered in any council database. "We call it the Void Fleet," Colonel Turner said. "Every ship in it was designed around a single principle. Overwhelming force delivered with total surprise, guided by artificial intelligence systems more advanced than anything the Council believes we possess, powered by dark matter propulsion that lets us move through space without leaving the kind of signature their sensors are built to detect." "For 60 years, Admiral Kavanaugh said, we let the galaxy believe we were exactly what we appeared to be: slow, cautious, grateful for whatever scraps of respect the older powers were willing to hand us. We endured unfair trade terms. We endured border violations. We endured every small humiliation because every single one of them bought us more time to finish what we were building in the dark. And Haven Colony," I said quietly, "was the final push." "Haven Colony," Admiral Kavanaugh said, "was 11,000 of our people, Delegate Cole, including your cousin, including a 7-year-old girl whose body we still have not recovered. The Council's laughter in that chamber was the last piece of confirmation we needed. They do not believe we have the will or the capability to answer this. They are wrong on both counts." I looked at the star chart again, at the dozens of shipyards hidden in systems no Council survey had ever bothered to examine closely, and felt something shift inside me, a mixture of grief and something colder, something that had been building since the moment I stood beside Lily Grant's hospital bed and had no answer for her question. "What happens now?" I asked. Colonel Turner's expression did not soften. "Now the President authorizes the order," she said, "and the Void Fleet moves for the first time in 60 years of waiting." The briefing room fell silent, except for the low hum of the ship's engines carrying us back toward Earth. I thought about Chancellor Osandrin leaning forward in that crystal chamber, calling the deaths of 11,000 people a lesson. I thought about the laughter that had followed me out of the Grand Hall, confident and careless, the laughter of beings who believed they understood exactly what humanity was capable of. They understood nothing. 3 hours later, the transport ship received a priority transmission from Earth, routed directly from the office of the President of the United Nations of Earth, a message with a single line of authorization that Admiral Kavanaugh read aloud to the room in a voice that did not waver. "Release the Void Fleet." Marcus Hale exhaled slowly beside me. Grace, who had slipped quietly into the room a few minutes earlier, gripped the back of my chair hard enough that her knuckles turned pale. I thought of Nathan Price, who I would never see again. I thought of Lily Grant, still lying in a medical bay somewhere behind us, asking a question nobody could answer. I thought of a 7-year-old girl whose name I had never even learned before her colony was reduced to ash and silence. And somewhere far beyond the edges of every chart the Galactic Council had ever drawn, in systems they had dismissed as empty for 60 long years, engines that had never once been tested in open combat began, quietly and without ceremony, to power on. The galaxy had spent 60 years laughing at what it believed humanity to be. It was about to meet what humanity actually was. I was standing on the bridge of a ship that did not officially exist when the Void Fleet moved for the first time. Admiral Kavanaugh had pulled me from the transport ship 2 days after the authorization order, citing a regulation I had never heard of, one that apparently allowed a diplomat with direct knowledge of a council incident to serve as a liaison officer during an active military response. I did not question it. I think, somewhere underneath the grief I was still carrying for Nathan Price and his daughter, I wanted to see this with my own eyes. The ship was called the Meridian's Vow, and nothing about its exterior gave away what it truly was. It looked, from the outside, like an aging cargo hauler, the kind of vessel the Council's sensors had scanned 1,000 times over the decades and dismissed without a second thought. Inside, it was something else entirely. A command deck wrapped in dark, seamless material that absorbed light instead of reflecting it. crew stations manned by officers who moved with a calm precision I had never seen outside of decades-old training footage. And at the center of it all, a tactical display that showed something I still find difficult to describe. Ships. Hundreds of them, spread across a dozen systems, converging toward a single coordinate point, deep inside territory the Threll Compact considered its own secure heartland. "Delegate Cole," said Colonel Turner, who stood beside the tactical display with her hands folded behind her back. "Welcome to the only front-row seat in the galaxy." "How many ships?" I asked. "More than the Council has ever built in its entire recorded history," she said. "And every single one of them has been sitting quietly in the dark for years, waiting for an order none of us wanted to give." I looked at the display again, at the slow, patient convergence of a fleet, the size of which I had never imagined humanity capable of assembling. Marcus Hale stood at a nearby station, monitoring communication traffic from the Threll Compact's border patrols that had no idea what was gathering just beyond the edge of their detection range. "What's the target?" I asked. "Kesh Vantar," Colonel Turner said. "The forward staging base the Threll Compact used to launch the attack on Haven Colony. It is the single most heavily defended position in their entire border region. 3 shipyards, 2 fleet bases, a garrison of nearly 40,000 personnel. And we're attacking it directly? We are demonstrating something," Admiral Kavanaugh said, arriving on the bridge with the quiet authority of someone who had spent years preparing for this exact moment. "Every species in the Galactic Council believes humanity lacks the capability to strike a fortified position and survive the attempt. We are about to correct that belief, permanently, in a way that leaves no room for doubt or negotiation." I felt a knot forming in my stomach, not fear for the Void Fleet, but a heavier, more complicated feeling, the weight of knowing that somewhere on that staging base were beings who had families of their own, some of whom likely had no part in the decision to attack Haven Colony. "Admiral," I said carefully, "how many casualties are we expecting?" Admiral Kavanaugh turned to look at me, and for the first time since I had met her, I saw something almost gentle in her expression. "Fewer than you fear, Delegate Cole," she said. "The Void Fleet was not built simply to destroy. It was built to disable, to dominate, to make continued resistance so clearly pointless that surrender becomes the only rational choice. We are not going to Kesh Vantar to erase it from existence. We are going there to prove that we could, and then to choose not to. That distinction, small as it seemed in the moment, would matter more than I understood at the time." The Meridian's Vow moved into position 4 hours later, sliding into the dark at the edge of the Kesh Vantar system, alongside 200 other vessels of the Void Fleet, all of them running silent, all of them invisible to a defense network that had never once needed to look for a threat approaching from this particular direction. I watched the tactical display as the fleet spread into formation, a slow, deliberate movement that reminded me less of an attack and more of a net being drawn closed around unsuspecting prey. Threll patrol ships continued their routine sweeps, utterly unaware that they were already surrounded. "All ships in position," reported a young officer at the communications station, her voice steady despite the enormity of what she was reporting. "Awaiting final authorization." Admiral Kavanaugh looked at the display for a long moment, and I understood, watching her, that this was not a decision she was making lightly, no matter how prepared humanity had been for 60 years. Every order she gave in the next few minutes would define how the rest of the galaxy understood humanity for generations to come. "Authorization confirmed," she said finally. "Begin the demonstration." What followed was unlike anything I had ever witnessed, and I found myself grateful, in a strange way, that the Void Fleet's design philosophy favored disabling force over total destruction, because what I watched unfold at Kesh Vantar could easily have been so much worse. The first wave of Void Fleet vessels emerged from stealth simultaneously across every quadrant of the system, their arrival marked not by weapons fire but by a coordinated pulse that swept through the Threll defense network, disabling shield generators and propulsion systems across the entire staging base in a matter of seconds. I watched the tactical display fill with a wave of quiet green markers, each one representing a Threll vessel that had just lost every offensive capability without a single shot being fired. "Shield network down," reported the tactical officer. "Enemy fleet propulsion systems disabled across all sectors. Garrison defense grid offline." Panic spread through the Threll communication channels almost instantly. Marcus Hale, monitoring the traffic, relayed fragments of increasingly desperate transmissions as officers on Kesh Vantar realized their entire defense network had been neutralized before they even understood what was attacking them. "They're trying to reach Council Command," Marcus said, requesting immediate reinforcement. "They don't understand what's happening to their systems." "Let them ask," Admiral Kavanaugh said quietly. "Nobody is coming." For the next several minutes, I watched a demonstration of power so complete, so overwhelming, that it left me with a strange, hollow feeling, rather than any sense of triumph. Void Fleet vessels moved through the Kesh Vantar system with total control, disabling weapons platforms, seizing control of shipyard docking systems, isolating the garrison's command center without a single casualty being reported from either side. It was not the violent, chaotic battle I had expected. It was something colder and, in its own way, far more unsettling. A demonstration that resistance was not simply difficult, but entirely, mathematically pointless. "Colonel Turner," I said, watching the display, "why are we doing this without loss of life? I thought the point was to make them understand what they're facing." "They will understand exactly what they're facing," she said. "A species capable of neutralizing their most heavily defended base without firing a single lethal shot understands something the Threll Compact needs to hear far more clearly than any casualty report could tell them. We are not attacking out of anger, Delegate Cole. We are demonstrating control. Control is a far more effective lesson than destruction, because destruction can be blamed on cruelty. Control cannot be explained away as anything other than what it is." I thought about that for a long moment, watching the tactical display show the last remaining pockets of Threll resistance at Kesh Vantar going silent, one after another, as their systems were brought under Void Fleet control. 40 minutes after the demonstration began, Admiral Kavanaugh received a transmission that every officer on the bridge had been waiting for. The garrison commander at Kesh Vantar, a Threll officer named Koresh Ondalan, was requesting direct communication with human command. "Put him through," Admiral Kavanaugh said. The main display shifted to show the face of Commander Ondalan, his silver features pale, his voice carrying none of the confidence I had heard from Chancellor Osandrin in the Grand Hall 6 days earlier. "You have disabled our entire staging base without engaging in open combat," Ondalan said. "I do not understand what weapon you have used against us." "There is no weapon, Commander," Admiral Kavanaugh said. "There is simply a species you chose to underestimate for 60 years, and a fleet you never bothered to search for because your council assumed weakness where there was only patience." "What do you want?" Ondalan asked, and for the first time I heard something in an alien voice that sounded remarkably, unmistakably human. "Fear." "I want you to relay a message to Chancellor Osandrin," Admiral Kavanaugh said. "Tell him that humanity's final warning was not a threat. It was a courtesy. There will not be a second one." The transmission ended, and the bridge fell into a silence that felt heavier than any celebration could have been. I looked at the tactical display, at the staging base sitting dark and disabled beneath the Void Fleet's control, and thought about Nathan Price, about Lily Grant, about a 7-year-old girl whose name I still did not know. None of this brought them back. I understood that clearly, standing on that bridge, but for the first time since the attack on Haven Colony, I felt something other than grief settle into the space where my anger had been living for 6 long days. I felt, for the first time, that the galaxy had finally begun to understand exactly what it had spent 60 years laughing at. Word of the demonstration at Kesh Vantar spread through council channels faster than any diplomatic message I had ever witnessed. Marcus Hale spent the following hours monitoring a flood of encrypted transmissions moving between Threll command centers, each one carrying a growing tone of confusion and alarm that had nothing to do with casualties and everything to do with the terrifying realization that humanity's true capabilities had been hidden in plain sight for 60 years. "They're trying to figure out how many more of these fleets we have," Marcus said, reading a transmission that had been partially intercepted. One of their intelligence officers is suggesting the WarHFY demonstration might represent our entire capability. Another is arguing it's only a fraction of it. Which one is correct? I asked. Colonel Turner allowed herself the smallest of smiles. That, she said, is precisely the question we want them asking for as long as possible. Admiral Kavanaugh turned toward me, her expression serious once more. Delegate Cole, she said, I need you to prepare for something. The Council will call an emergency session within the next day, once the full report from WarHFY reaches every delegation. When that happens, you will be the one speaking for Earth again. I felt the weight of that responsibility settle over me, heavier than anything I had carried into the Grand Hall 6 days earlier. What do I tell them? I asked. You tell them the truth, Admiral Kavanaugh said, that humanity did not want this outcome, that we spent 60 years hoping it would never be necessary, and that the next decision belongs entirely to them. Outside the viewport of the Meridian's Vow, the dark staging base of WarHFY drifted in silence, surrounded by a fleet the Council had never known existed, a fleet that had proven, in less than an hour, exactly how wrong 60 years of laughter had been. I did not feel triumphant standing there. I felt, more than anything, the quiet, exhausted relief of someone who had finally been heard, even if it had taken a demonstration this enormous to make it happen. But I also understood, watching Colonel Turner's expression as she studied the tactical display, that this was only the beginning of whatever came next, and that the hardest decisions the Void Fleet would ever make were still waiting somewhere ahead of us. The emergency council session was called 18 hours after the demonstration at WarHFY, and this time, nobody laughed when I walked through the doors of the Grand Hall. The silence that greeted me was heavier than the laughter had ever been. Delegates who had barely acknowledged my presence during the first warning now watched me with open, unguarded alarm, their translators humming quietly as they whispered among themselves. Chancellor Osandrin sat in his raised seat at the center of the chamber, and for the first time since I had met him, his silver features showed something other than confidence. I did not carry a data crystal this time. I did not need one. Delegate Cole, Osandrin said, and his voice lacked the condescension it had carried 6 days earlier. The compact has received your fleet's message regarding WarHFY. It was not my fleet's message, I said. It was Earth's answer to a question your compact asked when it attacked Haven Colony. You wanted to know how humanity would respond to unprovoked violence against our people. You have your answer. A murmur rippled through the chamber. I noticed several delegations exchanging quiet glances, species who had never been directly threatened by humanity, but who understood, perhaps for the first time, exactly how much they did not know about the newest member of their council. 40,000 personnel were stationed at WarHFY, Osandrin said. Your fleet disabled our entire defense network in less than an hour without engaging a single weapon system directly. I ask you plainly, Delegate Cole, because the compact deserves an honest answer. How many more fleets like that one does humanity possess? I had rehearsed this moment with Admiral Kavanaugh before boarding the shuttle back to the council station. She had been clear about what I could say and what I needed to leave unspoken. I am not authorized to disclose the full scope of our capabilities, I said. What I can tell you, Chancellor, is that WarHFY was not humanity's entire strength. It was a demonstration, carefully limited, designed to prove a point without forcing a war neither of our species can afford. And what point was that? Osandrin asked quietly. That humanity spent 60 years absorbing every insult, every unfair treaty, every act of aggression from your compact and others like it, because we believed patience would eventually earn us the respect this council refused to give freely, I said. We were wrong. Patience earned us nothing but more attacks, culminating in the deaths of 11,000 people at Haven Colony, including a child whose name this council never bothered to learn. I let that silence sit in the chamber for a long moment before continuing. The point, Chancellor, is that humanity is done waiting for this council to decide. We deserve to be treated as equals. We have already proven we are capable of far more than equals. The only remaining question is what kind of relationship we choose to have with the rest of this galaxy going forward. Asandrin's silver hands tightened on the arms of his seat. I could see him calculating, weighing every possible response, understanding for the first time that the species he had dismissed as primitive newcomers held power he had never imagined possible. "What does Earth require," he asked finally, "to consider this matter resolved?" I had expected this question, and Admiral Kavanaugh had given me a clear answer to carry into that chamber, one I delivered with as much steadiness as I could manage. "Full acknowledgement of the Compact's responsibility for the attack on Haven Colony," I said. "Reparations for the survivors, structured through terms our government will provide separately. A binding agreement, verified by independent council observers, that the Compact will never again violate human territory without formal, transparent negotiation. And finally, a permanent seat for Earth on the Council's Security Committee, the same committee that has excluded us since the day we first arrived at this table." The chamber erupted into overlapping conversation, delegates from a dozen species debating the implications of what I had just demanded. I noticed the Korvath elders, who had chuckled along with the laughter 6 days earlier, now speaking in low, urgent tones among themselves. Asandrin raised his hand for silence, and this time it came immediately, without hesitation. "And if the Compact refuses these terms," he said, "I thought about Kesh Vantar, about the quiet, total control the Void Fleet had demonstrated without a single casualty, about Admiral Kavanaugh's insistence that control was a more powerful lesson than destruction because it could never be dismissed as simple cruelty. Then humanity will not attack the Compact's remaining territories," I said. "We do not want a war, Chancellor. We have never wanted one. But we will continue demonstrating exactly how limited your Council's understanding of us has been, one staging base at a time, until every species at this table understands there is no version of the future where humanity accepts being treated as beneath consideration ever again." I watched something shift in Asandrin's expression, a slow, grudging recognition that the calculation he had made 6 days earlier, the assumption that humanity's warning was empty bluster from a weak, disorganized species, had been catastrophically wrong. "The Compact requires time to consider these terms," he said. "You have 1 day," I answered, "not because we are impatient, Chancellor, but because every additional day this Council spends deliberating is another day the families of Haven Colony wait for justice. They have already waited far too long to receive." I left the Grand Hall without waiting for a response, and this time no laughter followed me down the crystal corridor, only silence, and the particular kind of tension that settles over a room after everyone in it has finally understood the true shape of the danger they had spent 60 years underestimating. Grace was waiting for me at the shuttle, her expression tight with the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent the entire session monitoring back-channel communications from a dozen other delegations. "How did it go?" she asked. "They're afraid," I said. "For the first time since we joined this council, they are genuinely afraid." "Good," Grace said, and there was no satisfaction in her voice, only the flat, tired certainty of someone who had lost too much to feel anything resembling triumph. "Maybe now they'll remember Haven Colony every time they consider testing us again." The shuttle lifted off from the council station, and I spent the flight back to the Meridian's Vow thinking about Lily Grant, still recovering in a medical facility somewhere behind us, and about the daughter she would never see grow up. I thought about Nathan Price, and about every family across every human colony who had spent 60 years believing our government was too weak or too cautious to protect them from exactly this kind of tragedy. I understood, sitting in that shuttle, that whatever came next would not undo any of that grief. But it would, at the very least, ensure that no other family would have to bury a child because the galaxy assumed humanity too weak to answer for it. Admiral Kavanaugh met me personally when I returned to the Meridian's Vow, along with Colonel Turner and Marcus Hale, all 3 of them waiting in the same briefing room where I had first learned the Void Fleet existed. "The Compact's response," Admiral Kavanaugh said, without preamble. "1 day as we agreed," I said. "But Admiral, I need to ask you something honestly, before this goes any further." "Ask it," she said. "If they refuse," I said, "if Chancellor Asandrin decides tomorrow that pride matters more than the lives of his own people, what happens next? How far are we willing to go? The room fell quiet. Colonel Turner glanced at Admiral Kavanaugh, and I understood, watching that brief exchange, that this question had been debated extensively long before I ever asked it aloud. "We are not interested in conquest, Delegate Cole," Admiral Kavanaugh said finally. "The Void Fleet was built to protect what we have, not to expand what we control. If the Compact refuses our terms, we will continue demonstrating our capability against their military infrastructure, exactly as we did at Kesh Vantar, minimizing loss of life wherever possible, until the cost of continued defiance becomes so clearly unbearable that even the most stubborn pride cannot justify it any longer." "And if that never happens," I asked, "if they simply refuse to yield, no matter what we demonstrate?" Admiral Kavanaugh's expression did not waver, but something in her eyes told me this was the question that had kept her awake more nights than any other during the 60 years she had spent quietly building the fleet, now waiting in the dark beyond Kesh Vantar. "Then we will have learned something important about the nature of the galaxy we live in," she said. "But I do not believe it will come to that, Delegate Cole. Pride is powerful, but survival is more powerful still. Chancellor Osandrin has seen exactly what happens when humanity is pushed past its limits. I do not believe he is foolish enough to test that limit twice in the same week." I hoped, more than anything, that she was right. I thought of Lily Grant's question, the one she had asked me over and over in that medical bay, staring at the ceiling with the particular emptiness of someone who had lost everything that mattered to her. Why did they do this? I still did not have a complete answer, but for the first time since Haven Colony fell silent, I believed the galaxy was finally about to learn the answer to a very different question. Not why humanity had been attacked, but what happens to those who mistake patience for weakness and laughter for the final word. The next 24 hours passed slower than any I had experienced in my entire career in the diplomatic corps. I spent them aboard the Meridian's Vow, watching Marcus Hale monitor a steady stream of encrypted traffic between Threll command centers, traffic that grew increasingly fractured and desperate as different factions within the Compact argued over how to respond to terms they had never imagined being forced to accept. Colonel Turner remained calm throughout, occasionally offering quiet observations about the psychology of a species she had clearly studied for years in preparation for exactly this moment. Grace stayed close to me, and I found myself grateful for her presence more than I had words to express, especially during the long, silent stretches when neither of us could think of anything to say that did not circle back to Haven Colony. When the response finally came, it arrived not as a formal transmission to the council chamber, but as a direct private message addressed specifically to me, sent from Chancellor Osandrin himself. I opened it alone, in the small briefing room, my hands steadier than I expected them to be. The message from Chancellor Osandrin was shorter than I expected, and far heavier than its length suggested. "The Compact accepts Earth's terms," it read. "A formal delegation will arrive at the Council Station within 6 hours to begin reparation negotiations. Chancellor Osandrin requests a private meeting with Delegate Cole before the full Council session, to discuss matters he does not wish recorded in official channels." Then I carried it to Admiral Kavanaugh, who read it once, nodded slowly, and gave me a look I had not seen from her before, something close to quiet respect. "He wants to understand you," she said. "Not the fleet, not the demonstration at Kesh Vantar. You, specifically, the human who stood in that chamber and refused to be laughed out of the room." "Should I meet with him alone?" I asked. "Yes," Admiral Kavanaugh said. "This is exactly the kind of conversation that needs a human voice in the room, not a fleet commander's. Go, Delegate Cole. You have earned the right to finish what you started." I traveled back to the Council Station 6 hours later, alone this time, without Grace or Marcus or any escort beyond the shuttle pilot who dropped me at the private diplomatic entrance rather than the main hall. Chancellor Osandrin was waiting in a small meeting room overlooking the crystal moon's dark side, a room far less grand than the grand hall, lit only by the soft ambient glow of the walls themselves. He looked older than he had 6 days earlier, though I understood that had nothing to do with the passage of time and everything to do with the weight of decisions he had been forced to make in the hours since Kesh Vantar. "Delegate Cole," he said, gesturing to a seat across from him. "Thank you for meeting with me privately." You wanted to talk, I said, sitting down. I'm listening. Osandrin was quiet for a long moment, studying me with an expression I could not fully read. 6 days ago, he said finally, I laughed at you in front of the entire council. I want you to understand that I did not laugh because I believed your warning was empty. I laughed because I had spent decades believing humanity's caution was proof of weakness, and admitting otherwise would have meant admitting my own compact strategy toward your species was built on a catastrophic miscalculation. You attacked a colony of farmers to test a theory, I said. 11,000 people died because you needed proof of something you could have simply asked us directly. Would you have told us the truth if we had asked? Osandrin said. Would humanity have revealed the Void Fleet's existence to a council that had spent 60 years treating your species as a curiosity rather than an equal? I thought about that question longer than I expected to. No, I admitted, we would not have. We built that fleet in secret because we believed, correctly it turns out, that any older power aware of our true capability would have tried to neutralize it before we ever had the chance to use it. Then perhaps, Osandrin said quietly, we are more alike than either of us wish to admit. Both of our species have spent decades hiding our true nature from a galaxy we did not trust to treat us fairly. I did not have an easy answer for that, because some part of me recognized the uncomfortable truth in what he was saying. Humanity's caution and the Compact's aggression were different responses to the same underlying fear, the fear of being underestimated, exploited, or erased by powers older and more established than our own. The difference, Chancellor, I said finally, is that our caution never cost anyone their life.